Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. Today we have with us a very special guest, Augusto Lopez-Claros, who is the executive director of the Global Governance Forum, which is one of the leading bodies in the world that is advocating for improvements and reform within the UN system and the broader system of international law and governance, with the goal really being to bring us closer and closer to the original objectives that the drafters of the UN Charter envisaged just over 80 years ago. A more peaceful world, a more prosperous world, a more equitable world. Augusto speaking to us today from Madrid in Spain. So, Augusto, welcome back to Democracy Tomorrow.
Hello, Scott. It's a pleasure to be back with you. It's always fun to have a conversation.
Excellent. Well, you run a very great organization which is doing many great things, incredibly insightful publications and excellent conferences and things of that nature. We've just had the 80th anniversary of the UN Charter, of course. In September, in 2 months' time, the UN General Assembly will be convening its annual meetings. Given the tumult and the level of instability in the world today, the declining interest in support to the humanitarian sector, generally speaking, the sort of unraveling of many of the international agreements and entanglements that have held the world together for the past 8 decades. Can we expect anything big and major from this upcoming meeting of the UNGA in 2 months' time in New York?
I suppose I can answer that question at two levels. First, the level in which you intend the question, which is in the aggregate. Is it likely to lead to some kind of new initiative? There is currently underway a kind of a process called United Nations at 80, which aims to look at possible improvements in efficiency, better allocation of resources, a streamlining of activities, looking at whether, given the budgetary constraints, the UN is getting the most out of the resources that it receives from the member states. And I think that exercise is useful. I think it is, at least for many countries, it is well-intentioned in the sense that it is always possible for an organization that has an annual budget of something like $75 billion in the most comprehensive measure of budget, including peacekeeping operations, earmark contributions from a handful of member states, and so on and so forth. It's always possible to ask, can we spend the money more effectively? Are there gains in efficiency which could be precipitated by a savvier use of resources? And to the extent that process leads to some recommendations, I think this would be positive. At the same time, however, I think that there is a risk that this exercise could simply be a way to disguise the fact that member states are not willing at this particular moment to look at a more fundamental rethinking of the institutional underpinnings of the United Nations, right? For instance, whenever you talk about UN reform to any ambassador in New York, the first thing that comes to the conversation is the Security Council. The perception that the Security Council has become fully dysfunctional, that it operates under a system that lacks credibility, especially 80 years after the end of World War II, when there has been such a rapid shift in the composition of relative economic and political power, right? The fact that India, the most populous state, and probably within a few years the world's #3 economy, doesn't get to serve on the Security Council except once every, whatever, 10, 15, 20 years. It seems very odd, bizarre. I think it's a better word to describe it, right? Will there be any progress in September in addressing this issue? I think not. I think it's unlikely, right? So there is a way in which this exercise, looking at budgets and efficiencies, it can be an excuse not to look at the really fundamental issues that I think are very much at the core of the question: how do we transform the UN into a problem-solver organization?
I mean, one of the problems, of course, is that the very few people in the world today realize the scale of good that the UN does and has been doing for decades. I mean, it's not perfect, but the amount of people that it reaches, the amount of people that it assists is truly astounding. And, whether we like it or not, it's the best that we have at the time. And it could be better, and it could be designed in a better way. It could be more global in orientation and less based on nation states, more based on humanity. But it is what we have. And it really seems today that there's waning interest by member states and the public at large in the UN and the promise that it holds. And this is evident in many ways, not just declining budgets, but I would say from an ordinary layperson's perspective, there was virtually no attention placed on the 80th anniversary of the UN Charter a couple months ago, just a month ago, less than a month ago. You would have to look hard to find major stories in the major news outlets about this monumental event, really. So progress needs to be made. If we focus just on the idea of the Security Council, the fact that there is even a Security Council in historical terms is a great step forward. But as you mentioned, it's clearly dysfunctional in its current formulation. I did a little calculation earlier today, and it's something in the range of only 25% of humanity is permanently represented by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So 75% of humanity, 6 billion people or so, are only occasionally represented on the most powerful body of the United Nations. So clearly, as you mentioned, India, Brazil, a whole range of other countries that could have pretty good arguments to support their own inclusion in that body. Those arguments exist, but maybe we need an entirely new structure somehow. Maybe we need some sort of situation where there is no permanent membership in this body, because clearly it's linked to political power. We all know that. And the victory that several of those members had at the end of World War II. Can we imagine, is there any possibility that you see that the global majority population could be so influential that it could lead to the development of a Security Council which was truly representative of the people as a whole, as opposed to just the victors of World War II and the larger economies of the world?
It's a very, very, very excellent question, Scott. The Global Governance Forum put out a revision of what the UN Charter could look like in the 21st century. We published it actually a couple of days before the Summit of the Future in September of 2024. And in that revised version of the Charter, which we call the second United Nations Charter, we actually have a fairly sensible proposal to address, this dual problem with the Security Council, the issue of representation and the issue of the veto. The issue of representation it's actually perhaps the one that is most readily available for a practical solution. The problem with the existing system is that you have a concentration of power in the 5 permanent members, and then you have 10 positions that rotate every couple of years among the 188 other members, which basically means that most countries get to serve on the Security Council once every 3 decades, and in fact, there are 62 countries that have never served on the Security Council in the entire history of the UN system, right? So if you happen to be a citizen of one of these countries, your voice has never been heard on security issues, right? So what we're proposing is to expand the membership from 15 to 25. We allocate 5 slots under a system of 6-year renewable tenures. The UN divides the world into 5 regions. So, for instance, Brazil could opt for as representing Latin America to a 6-year renewable term and effectively become a permanent member, or permanent in the sense of always being there at the table, right? And then we create 15 other slots, 3-year non-renewable terms, which are allocated among all the other five regions proportionally to the number of countries in each region. So Africa gets 5 slots because it's got many members in the UN, and therefore, there is a substantial African representation all the time on the Security Council. If you ask me, is this a good way to resolve the issue of representation? Absolutely. I think, there is no downside. It's what we economists call a Pareto improvement. Everybody is better off. No one is worse off, in this new system. On the issue of the veto, our second charter proposes a kind of a novel way to deal with it. We introduced the concept of a veto override. So if 2/3 of the General Assembly overrides a particular veto in the Security Council, then the resolution goes forward, right? And so the permanent members get to keep the veto, which is something that probably they would be very reluctant to give up. But it is now subject to a much higher standard, before it actually becomes effective, right? They have to persuade 2/3 of the membership of the General Assembly.
That would be something that would be quite doable rather frequently, I would say, if you look at when the veto's been used by certain members of the council. Yeah, you could easily get that 2/3 majority override based upon current sentiments in the GA.
Yeah. One of the things that really puzzles me about the veto when you talk to people, UN ambassadors and, academics and so on, that the way that it is framed in people's minds, it's just basically the right that a permanent member has to say no at a particular moment in time, right? But it's actually much more pervasive than that. In fact, the reason why the veto was strongly opposed by 17 countries at the San Francisco conference in 1945, to the point that they threatened to boycott the conference and leave, which then led to the introduction of Article 109, which opens, the way for a review conference. The reason is that the veto, in fact, exempts the 5 permanent members from the obligations of the charter. It basically, through the power of the veto, they are essentially conveying a message to all the other members, is that the charter, 188 countries, it is your responsibility to agree to the principles and to abide by its obligations. But we, the permanent 5, can actually exempt ourselves from it, right? So it's like joining a club in which a handful of members say the rules apply to you, silly people, not to us, the powerful, right? It's just morally bankrupt. I mean, it's, there is no conceivable ethical system in which you can actually justify the existence of this practice, right? And in fact, there is an article in the UN Charter that explicitly forbids a country that is a party to a conflict, right, to actually vote on the Security Council. So, in the case of Russia and Ukraine in 2022, because Russia is a party to that conflict, according to the UN Charter, it should exempt itself from participating in a session of the Security Council, right? But that is not the way that particular article has been interpreted. Although the interpretation is quite obvious. If you read it, it's clear. You cannot be a party. You cannot vote if you are a party to a conflict. Right? So I think that my own personal view is that the veto, while indefensible, at the same time, it is perhaps a somewhat overvalued privilege, right? I mean, let me give you an example. Again, go back to Russia, 2022, the invasion of Ukraine. Russia vetoed a resolution from the Security Council essentially telling them, get out. You're violating the UN Charter. You have no business doing this. It went to the General Assembly. by an overwhelming majority, 141 members, basically approved the resolution telling the Russians to get out and reminding them the extent to which they were violating the UN Charter. And then, notwithstanding the veto, it did not prevent a whole range of countries supporting Ukraine to defend itself against Russian aggression, right? So what did Russia get out of its veto in the Security Council? Not very much, not very much. Maybe some symbolism, right? But as you know, Russia has had great difficulties in sort of delivering on its strategic and military goals as outlined on the eve of the invasion. It was supposed to be a cakewalk. It was supposed to be done in 3 days. Well, 3 years later, they control whatever 19% of Ukrainian territory and are having great difficulties controlling more, right? And so the veto, from my perspective, wasn't worth very much, right? And so, but having said that, it's something that should be done with for sure.
Well, I think in the eyes of the public, it sort of undermines the integrity and fairness of the entire system, right? To give 5 out of 193 members these special powers, which are clearly linked to their political position and economic position in the world, it ends up undermining the strength of the system, one could argue, and therefore leads to a lack of interest in that system and a lack of reliance upon it to achieve the objectives that it purports to seek to achieve, So, I can imagine, you've been and your group have been a strong supporter of the idea of a parallel body to the General Assembly, the Parliamentary Assembly idea, which is more of a popular body that would be decided upon perhaps by a direct vote by people from around the world that would act in parallel to the General Assembly. I'm wondering if some sort of alternative version of the Security Council could also be formed on the basis of the Parliamentary Assembly, and that body, comprised of individual people, entrusted with applying international law as per the nature of the law in question, and that body could also issue opinions and views and resolutions regarding the very same issues that the Security Council is dealing with, and see if they come up with the same answers. And I'm sure they would not in many instances. And I have a feeling that we need a whole new sort of impetus, a whole new wave of energy to be infused into the global system of governance, as your organization is doing and others are doing, to really begin to design a structure that is far more democratic than it is today and far less based on the will and wishes and whims of nation states who continue to act essentially in their own so-called self-defined national interests. I mean, the very nature of the nation state itself has that fundamental flaw. And we will never have world governance structure based upon our shared humanity as long as nation states are allowed to guide the process as they have been until now. Now, this is, one of the hugest questions one could ever ask. How do we move from the system of nation states, which has many, many, many positive attributes, particularly compared to what came before? But maybe we're at the stage now, given the crisis in the system, to really begin questioning more, not the value of nationalism and authoritarianism and autocracy and declining democracy like is happening in so many nation states of the UN, but to look forward to a much more integral system that is truly based on our shared humanity, where the role of the nation state per se continually goes down as the power of ordinary people voting within a global democratic structure go up. Do you see any prospect of that vision happening anytime soon?
Well, in the second United Nations Charter, which we published last September, we actually propose a kind of a reconfiguration of the foundations of the UN. The UN, although the UN Charter, as you well know, begins with "we the peoples," the UN is actually an organization of member states, right? In fact, Albert Einstein in 1947 wrote a letter to the General Assembly, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in which he said, the members of this body are diplomats. They represent the government back in power, in power back at home. You should elect directly the members of the General Assembly via popular vote in the member nations, and this will create more of a connection between the organization and the people that the organization is representing and whose interests it is defending, right? So in the second charter, what we do is we maintain the General Assembly as a body of member states. For now, we keep the one country, one vote system. But then we call for the creation of a second chamber, a parliamentary assembly, whose members are elected under the principle of digressive proportionality. In other words, it's not one country, one member, but rather, India and China, because they're more populous, they get more members in the parliamentary assembly, but proportionally less than, the smaller country. And so the idea, and then we give the countries the choice to either send members of the national parliament to represent as representatives in the parliamentary assembly, or to elect them directly via popular vote, which I know would be the case in Europe. As you know, the European experience is very interesting. In the late 50s in Europe, what was then a European Parliamentary Assembly, which was just basically national parliamentarians getting together and providing counsel and advice to the politicians, they went to a process of direct elections. And since 1979, every 5 years, the 27 members of the European Union elect their deputies in the European Parliament via national vote, right? So the advantage, and then, how do you integrate this new body into the existing UN structure? Well, you could do this gradually. For instance, you could give it initially an advisory role, right? The idea is that the members of the Parliamentary Assembly are not representing national interests. In fact, some of the members may be from the opposition, right? If they are elected in Spain, if they are elected, for instance, directly via popular vote, there is no certainty that those persons elected will necessarily be members of the current party in power, which is the Socialist Party. Some of them could be from the opposition, right? And so these people will be there serving in the Parliamentary Assembly, representing the interests of the people, broadly defined. And what we would expect is that coalitions would be formed within the members of the Parliamentary Assembly that would be more focused on issues rather than the national interest. Because, in fact, in our second charter, there is an explicit prohibition of the member state instructing its parliamentary members, as to what positions to take. No, they don't respond to the national government. They respond to the people who elected them, right? And so you create a body that has a closer connection to the people, number one. Number two, it can become a source of innovation, a source of reform proposals. It can enhance the quality of the debate within the UN system as to what needs to be done to make the UN more effective, more efficient in the 21st century in light of the challenges that we face. And so for me, it's an innovation. And interestingly, it doesn't need amending the UN Charter, because Article 22 of the UN Charter gives the General Assembly the power to establish bodies, subsidiary bodies. So the General Assembly could actually very easily establish a parliamentary assembly initially as an advisory body, just by a vote within the General Assembly. So for me, it's a no-brainer. And this idea has gained broad support across the world. There are resolutions from the European Parliament, from a number of other regional parliaments and bodies, literally hundreds and hundreds of fellow parliamentarians from many member countries are firmly behind this idea. So for me, it's the kind of reform which could easily be implemented in the next few years. And I think the gains would be considerable.
Has it ever been formally proposed at the General Assembly in the form of a resolution or anything like that? Or is this
Not
all largely from outside?
not yet, not yet. What we the Global Governance Forum, we are working with an international coalition that has just been set up about a year ago to persuade member states to issue a General Assembly resolution in 2027 calling for an Article 109 review conference. We think that the time has come to do this, right? For the reasons that everybody knows. The UN is dysfunctional. The fact that the UN is dysfunctional, as you know, is already leading to a kind of a shift to other power centers where other informal bodies, which are not really representative of humanity, are beginning to take much more of a leadership role. G20 is a very good example. The BRICS, which is a somewhat more amorphous coalition, they also have pretensions, and some of these trends are basically in response to the sense that the UN, is no longer effective because it's hampered, because it's saddled with these institutional rigidities, the veto among them, right? And therefore, in our pursuit for solutions to whatever climate change, geopolitical tensions, conflict, the possibility of war, and so on and so forth, those debates are moving to other places. And this is sad because, the UN remains a truly universal body, right? It accounts for 99.9% of the world's population. And as you know, and as you mentioned before, it has had, many important achievements in its long history, which suggests to us that the best way to improve our global governance architecture is to work within that system and to improve it, make it more efficient, eliminate some of its rigidities and do away with some of these indefensible principles, right? But build on it rather than diffuse its power and allocate responsibilities to different bodies which have even more problems than the UN.
Yeah, I mean, you've had a lengthy career working within and outside of the UN, with the UN. I've done countless things with the UN. We know its strengths, we know its weaknesses. But I think what's really lacking now is this spirit of humanitarianism that was so strong at the end of the Second World War. And this feeling that we're all in this together. We don't ever want war to come again. Humanity must be united to build a brighter and war-free future. And now what we hear very often in the media of the world, and of course in social media and all these other places, is very dismissive attitudes towards human suffering, essentially, in regions of the world different than one's own. I hear repeated sentiments along these lines in ways that haven't been around for decades. The recent decision by the United States to get rid of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, which is, one agency in a world of many agencies and so on and so forth. But a recent study that just came out indicates that that decision alone is going to result in 14 million additional deaths by 2030. This is a staggering finding, and it's almost like it's nothing. And we can give countless examples of conflict and war and occupation and everything else across the world now, which, of course, aside from the human suffering, bring people's belief and embrace of the system into doubt. And so you mentioned BRICS, the G20, other sort of alternatives that are beginning to be, more looked at than before, which people see somewhat as alternatives to the UN. And in a world where, the United States, still the most powerful country in the world, has essentially turned its back on foreign affairs, on the UN, on international humanitarian assistance, uses the UN only when it's convenient to do so for its own national interests. It's obvious that there's going to be a move away by many people, many governments from that point of view, those who still believe in the international rules-based order, um, towards something else. So the question is, BRICS is already happening whether we like it or not, and it's being perceived, whether we like it or not, as a viable alternative that may in fact even come up with its own currency that represents a huge portion of the global economy, that represents a huge portion of the world's population, which does not consider itself bound at all to the rules and norms that necessarily guide the international legal order of today. But I heard one commentator say, as flawed as the BRICS model is, and that was his point of view, at least it shows there is a possibility of an alternative. So let's use that possibility of an alternative to start building something more. So that's kind of, I would love to get your opinion on this. Our point of view, of course, is the impossible dream, right? The world of 8.2 billion people all sharing the same nationality, sharing the planet, living as equals among equals in a world far better and more peaceful and more egalitarian than the one we have today. We are still as far from achieving that in real terms as we ever have been. But we firmly believe that it's only through that methodology can we bring about a global civilization that has the highest likelihood of surviving for millennia to come. Nation states combined with environmental destruction, combined with climate change, combined with weak global governance, combined with the presence of nuclear weapons in far too many hands, et cetera, and gross inequality that just gets worse by the day. They're all recipes for disaster. And when you bring in rising authoritarianism, I mean, the recent election yesterday in Japan, another great example, the only gains were made by extreme right-wing parties, very anti-immigrant, anti-foreign, et cetera. This is happening all over the place, as we know. There are countervailing forces too, but this is happening over and over. We all know this. Maybe we need to give even more deep thought to the idea of what could come next. We can reform, and I fully support all the work that you're doing and others are doing to reform the UN system. But, it seems to me that we also need to push even more and get back on the agenda the idea that we are human beings first and foremost. It's as simple as that. There's nothing radical about that statement. We were all born on Earth. We all have the same needs and wishes and wants. And yet our various identities are now defining us to such a degree that we are pushing our species to the point of oblivion. And yes, we can use the institutions that we have, the UN, governments generally. But unless we really embrace and rediscover that shared sense of humanity, I'm very fearful that these forces that have been unleashed in recent years will lead to their inevitable and very predictable end, which history has shown us time and time again, which is yet another conflict, yet another number of years where the whole world falls apart. And then finally people will get tired of fighting, and then they will come together again and rediscover our humanity, build something new, and the cycle will repeat itself. And, I hope that there are minds out there by the millions, and if not billions, who very much wish to build a global order based on our shared humanity. I believe very firmly, even though it doesn't appear like it on the surface, when you speak to people all around the world, as we do, the vast majority of people that I speak to totally agree with these sentiments. Everybody wants something better than what we have. And we must be able to achieve that if there's enough of us that demand it. And I firmly believe if enough of us do demand it, that's what we will end up getting. So how do we go back there? How do we get people to re-embrace not the greatness of Spain or the greatness of America or the greatness of Israel or the greatness of Botswana, but the greatness of the planet, the greatness of our species, the greatness of, the ecosystem on which we all depend. How do we get people to rediscover that basic truth and work to build a system that cherishes that?
You know, you raise very, very fundamental issues, and let's just pick up, two or three of the strands that you just presented. I totally agree with the idea that as a human family, there is a great deal more that unites us and that we share in common and than that separates us and establishes, barriers between us, right? If you were to make an informal survey and, walk down the streets of, half a dozen countries, so, in every one of the continents, and you were to ask people, tell me, do you want to live in a world that is environmentally sustainable, in which you want to make sure that your child is not drinking water laden with lead? They will readily say, yes, of course. Environmental sustainability, being protected from the calamities of violent climate change is something that we share across cultures, right? Do you want to live in a world in which the rules apply to all, in which we don't have a set of rules for the elites and the wealthy and a set of rules for everybody else? And people will tell you, yes, of course, we do want to have, a sense of social justice. What about economic security? Do you want to make sure that your children are going to be fed tomorrow? Do you want to live in a world in which the global economy operates in a way that provides a degree of protection for everybody, although perhaps admitting some differences in income and so on? And I can make this list even more extensive, right? So there is already a set of human values that are shared across cultures, across races, across various religious identities, right? And on top of this, of course, we have insights that come from science, right? The scientists, the people who map the human genome, have already told us there is only one humanity. Our genetic makeup is 99.99% the same, regardless of whether we are Black Africans or blonde, blue-eyed Swedes or Scandinavians, right? The problem is that, especially in terms of the latter insight coming from science, which is saying there is one humanity, is that our educational system has not yet embedded that insight in a formal way, so that we begin to actually systematically teach our children this sense of world citizenship, this sense that we are one human family. The founder of the Baha'i faith had a very poetic way of saying this. Directing himself to humanity, he said, you are the leaves of one tree, you are the drops of one ocean, right? In other words, yes, if you take a look at two leaves, there may be slight differences, but they are essentially part of the same nature, and so for me, you also mentioned the question of solidarity. Let me tell you something about solidarity. I totally agree with you. We live in a world in which, there is a certain kind of segmentation, right, where you see less and less concern for those who live under very unfavorable conditions. You mentioned the demise of USAID. Not to say that this was a perfect organization, not to say that there was no possibility of improvements in the quality of its programs, but I think that there is a universal consensus, at least among the experts, not the fanatics, but the experts, that this organization, as well as other aid agencies, right? Because it's not just USAID, all the high-income countries have their own aid agencies, and they try to do good in the world. They try to bring nutrition, vaccination, to relieve the the rigors of extreme poverty in remote corners of the world, right? And now, my point here is that the calamities that are in the pipeline and that are coming our way, specifically those linked to climate change, although not only, if we have a global financial crisis because our financial system implodes, and there are objective reasons as to why that could happen, that is going to have, global implications. The high-income countries as well as other countries will be affected, right? But climate change in particular, to come back to this idea, is going to hit us all. It will not make distinctions across between levels of income, between color of our skins, between our religious background. And to me, when those crises come, I think it will impress upon people what it means to be poor, what it means not to have food on your table, what it means to have malnourished children, right? And that, in a kind of a perverse, painful way, might precipitate a sense of solidarity among the well-off countries, the high-income countries, and it might lead them to perhaps understand the concept of our common humanity through the pain and the suffering that they will go through and they will experience, right? It's not a nice way to go through that process, right? One would wish that solidarity would be plentiful and would come out from people's hearts, right? And that instead of destroying an aid agency, we would try to improve it and give it more resources and enhance its footprint in the planet, where we have 800 million malnourished children, and so on and so forth, right? But if that's not the way, then the way will be the way of suffering and pain, and it will include, unfortunately, everybody, the whole world, including people in the high-income countries who today perhaps feel safe, they feel secure, they feel privileged, they feel that the suffering is out there in the remote corners of the planet. Well, they will be in for a surprise. That suffering will come to their homes too.
Yeah, and I mean, my fear is that they will feel the suffering, but instead of becoming, having more solidarity with the rest of the world, they will instead build higher walls and attempt to create safe havens for themselves at the expense of everyone else. I mean, that's a very depressing and nihilistic prediction, but I think there's a lot of writing on the wall that things will go more in that direction than one in the way that you're speaking. I hope it does.
Scott, maybe for a little while, right? Maybe for a while, right? It's a kind of a natural response, right? You build up walls to protect yourself from the suffering elsewhere. But you see, what is inescapable about many of the challenges that we face, and climate change comes, as the exhibit number one, is that in order to address it and solve it in a meaningful way, you cannot do it through, autonomous national policies. It requires international cooperation. Climate change will not be solved unless all the nations of the world come together, especially, the big players, right? The US, European Union, China, Russia, the 10 or so countries that account for whatever, 80% of emissions, and of course the others as well, in a spirit of participation, we all have to collaborate. So building up walls, isolating yourself from the rest of the world, is not going to lead to a solution. So after a while, yeah, we will realize, these walls are actually not in our national interest. We need to reach out. We need to work with others. We need to explicitly incorporate in our policy design on a global scale the notion of we are one human family confronting these global challenges. We need to collaborate. We need to come together. Hence the motivation for our second United Nations Charter, you see, because it is establishing a legal framework that will facilitate that cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's hope that ever more numbers of people begin to see the obvious, and that, when you stand back, if aliens were to come to Earth and who had never seen Earth before and had a look at it, and said, what are these guys doing down there? Imagine what that place could be compared to what it is. I mean, that's the kind of approach I have, is that, we have everything we need. We're not doing it right. We're pushing things in the wrong direction. And if we don't do something rather quickly, it's very well within the realms of possibility that it will, in fact, be too late. And that this experiment of this magical thing called life will have been for nothing. I mean, we've reached this stage where climate change is far worse than most people realize. Global land degradation is infinitely worse than most people realize. The destruction of the oceans is worse than people realize. The pollution of space is much worse than people realize. The state and the power of AI is much worse than people realize. The list goes on. Nuclear weapons, I could go on and on and on and on. So it should be sufficient to look back at those things and say, we really need a better way, guys. Come on, But most people, most places it's a lot easier to convince people to look inward and be nationalistic and feel a sense of greatness about your own place in the world than it is to look outwards and embrace the entire planet. It just somehow seems to be more difficult for most people, most places. Most people still don't have very much experience with people from other places, which is an issue. We're very lucky. To us, it's second nature. But only 5% of humanity, we're part of that, live outside of the countries of their birth. And most of those did it out of extreme economic or political necessity. So most people, most places are still only really familiar with what goes on in the territory of their own country. And that's fine. But as you said totally perfectly, we have to infuse our education system, our cultures, our religions, our economics, our politics with this sense that we are all dependent on the same very place where we were all born and where we will all die, which is this miracle planet in this distant corner of the universe, which is so remarkable in every single way. And yet so many people forget that basic point, that people will think what I'm talking about sounds ridiculous. People will say, oh, what are you talking about? All this, namby-pamby talk about the glories of Earth and stuff. But it's true, and like, I firmly believe that, because I was brought up as a person exactly like the person I am not now. Total nationalist, total rah-rah for my country of origin, blah, blah, blah. And, it took a long time to get out of that, right? And it takes it's a big effort for a lot of people to transcend their national identity or their national country. I always hearken back to this simple scientific fact that our little planet is the only place in the universe that we know of with sentient beings on it in 2 trillion known galaxies. Isn't that enough of a fact for you to want to embrace the entire thing and to make it better? I mean, I don't know how you couldn't take that into account in determining how your life is going to play itself out. But not enough of us have gotten there yet. But let's hope that with all these people of goodwill, yourself included, can utilize, very much like an Aikido master does in martial arts, utilize the negative energy of the opponent against the opponent. So we have no aggressive moves ourselves, but we use the bad movements of those who pursue selfish, greedy, nationalistic behavior and use that as an inspiration for people everywhere to embrace humanity as a whole, as one family, because that's, simply put, as far as I'm concerned, and I think as far as you're concerned, that's the basic truth of the matter. So any final thoughts? How can we get people more in this direction, Augusto? What are your final thoughts for today?
Oh, I'm a kind of a long-term optimist. I do not wish to suggest that what you have just said in terms of the risks to our future associated with the resurgence of nationalism and this lack of understanding of our essential unity and the commonality of our interests. those are real enough problems, and we seem to be going through a tough phase at the moment, right? With the retreat, for instance, by the United States from the international stage, and the rise of authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world, and so on and so forth. But I will come back to a point that I made earlier, right? I think that those approaches will soon be perceived for what they are, which are very ineffective ways to try to confront the problems that we face. And when their utter bankruptcy and failure is demonstrated, right, throughout the planet, when we realize that climate change continues to come upon us, with the calamities and precipitating human suffering and so on, when we see that, God forbid, some of the geopolitical tensions manifest themselves in violent conflict, as we are seeing now in Russia and Ukraine and in other parts of the world, that it will lead to a fundamental reassessment on the part of humanity of the values that we have, right? That is already happening. I interact a lot with young people. I give lots of lectures in universities and in educational institutions. I am really so encouraged that young people today, if they were to hear what you have just said over the last 5-10 minutes, they would say, I'm with Scott. I very much feel that we are one human family, and that we need to work together to address these global challenges, right? So in a sense, this generational shift, with the older populations dying out, with the politicians today being replaced by a younger cohort of politicians who are much more attuned, to these notions of unity, these notions of togetherness, these notions of solidarity, for me, is the hope for the future, right? My hope is that these processes take over before we completely destroy ourselves, right? That's the big question, right? Are these changes going to become effective before we do much more damage to ourselves? Or will we have to pick up the pieces in a kind of a post-crisis world after some kind of major calamity, and then ask ourselves, how do we rebuild our existing order? How do we create institutions that can channel this sense of human family brought about by global human suffering?
Absolutely true. And, we are called Democracy Tomorrow because we believe that if enough people in enough places put energy into creating a truly democratic world, that is the world that we will get. But we have to make it happen. It's not just going to happen on its own. We have to demand it, and we have to provide very concrete and viable practical strategies to bring this into existence. And as you just said, I believe the numbers of people, even as a percentage of humanity, who would like to see the world that we've been talking about come into being is overwhelmingly larger in number than those who wish to keep the status quo or pursue something even worse. And so I think we have the numbers. I think world citizens are the majority of the planet as it is today. We need to build the processes, the movement, the institutions to make that happen. And I think together, in the end, we can and will prevail and allow our extraordinary species to truly live up to its potential. We've barely scratched the surface. So let's keep going. So thank you very much again, Augusto. It's always a great pleasure talking to you and getting your insights into what's going on at the international level and on all of these issues. Hope to talk to you again soon. Thanks for watching, everybody. This has been another episode of Democracy Tomorrow. Please subscribe if you like what we're doing. Send a like and let us know in the comments below what other issues you would like us to talk about, and we will promptly get to those. So thanks again for watching. This is the World Citizen Network. Join us, and together we can build a global democracy tomorrow. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.